All right, there are two types of people in this audience. The type of people who've heard of Jeffrey Tucker, and you people are excited. The type of people who haven't heard of Jeffrey Tucker, and you're lucky, because you now have the opportunity to get to hear one of the most dynamic voices in the liberty movement explain things in a way that is so crystal clear and so exciting that, what? It's all true. The founder of Liberty.me, it's going to soon roll out, and one of the greatest liberty speakers of our time, Jeffrey Tucker.
There is nothing I can say or do to live up to that introduction, so that's catastrophic, actually.
In the early years of the Bitcoin boom, I attended a raucous and truly hilarious conference of newly rich digital titans. The year was 2014, I believe. The town was Miami, and Bitcoin had just hit $1,000. In those days, the ethos of the early investors was to spend. Like crazy. After all, this goofy spendable token seemed to be growing on trees.
Bitcoin. Physical Bitcoin.
One day, your computer is grinding away mining magic money that no one used, and the next thing you know, you have 100,000 K in your paw. You did nothing to earn it other than volunteer some processing power. Why not live it up? There was a strange psychology at work in those days. That this tiny protocol worked defied belief, and yet it was real. Let's test just how real. At this conference, yes, living it up was the way. Ferraris and Maseratis filled the Miami streets. People traded one for another using digital wallets on their smartphones, a trick made possible only under the influence. Liquor flowed like I've never seen. The music, the lights, the opulence. You could choose among multiple yachting outings with endless amounts of food, fun, and live music. Those were the days. Soon after, however, Bitcoin turned south.
It's a virtual currency which only exists on the internet. Bitcoin, as it's called, bypasses the traditional banking system and has become increasingly attractive as it doesn't involve exchanging currencies. But it's seen a sharp fall in its value today, and this is why.
The $1,000 price sank to $335. There was sadness all around. All that celebration was for naught. The newly rich were not only not rich anymore, they were now stuck with all kinds of cars, boats, and houses that they could not afford to keep up. What happened to the great slogan, "To the moon"? It felt in those days like magic internet money was turning to dust. The whole thing was ridiculous. I watched Bitcoin go from $0 to $14 before I wrote my first public article about it, and soon it turned to $30. People were screaming that it was an insane bubble about to explode, which it did, before reaching new highs again. I never saw $300 as low. Even $3 was something of a miracle so far as I was concerned. Bitcoin had finally become the digital currency about which we had been dreaming for 15 years. I never saw it as an investment so much as a technology.
And it wasn't widely understood at the time. But the creation of the Federal Reserve did more than just cartelize the banking industry. What it did was more or less nationalize the money stock. Nationalization meant the end of innovation in money. So money was no longer, as a unit, as a good, as a product, as a service, was no longer able to keep pace with the innovations in the world of the rest of industry. And we've been now in this situation more or less for 100 years. And you'll notice that money is not just uninnovative and has failed to keep pace. I mean, for example, imagine if we had to use 1913 style phones today, or 1913 style cars, or if we were still stuck, with 1913 style shoes. That's more or less the situation we are in with money. But that's the best possible thing. Actually, money has gotten vastly worse. It's today's dollar is worth about a nickel compared to the dollar of 1913. Governments have more or less destroyed money and dragged it back. And it's not entirely clear how many people have been aware of this.
All these years later, we can see that the huge crashes of the past, which looked so scary at the time, are minor blips barely discernible in the long-run pattern of up, up, and up. Live through enough of these and you stop sweating it out. It has been for all these years until recently when the 3 steps forward, 2 steps back pattern changed into a firm 20K, then 30K, then 40K. Bitcoin seems to be taking steps towards being an alternative world reserve currency.
So the Federal Reserve simply does not have authority to supervise or regulate Bitcoin in any way because there is no central issuer or network operator to regulate.
Let's look at the larger question of what this could mean for our lives. Bitcoin has performed for 12 years as a deflationary asset. This is to say that the value of the unit grows ever more valuable in terms of goods and services. This is the opposite of an inflationary asset like the US dollar, which is worth about 5 cents compared to its pre-World War I value, thanks to monetary mismanagement in which the Federal Reserve flooded markets with money to pay for government spending and debt and bailing out banking systems when they got in trouble.
One of the biggest calamities happened actually at the Great Depression, right? So you had a big stock market run up in the late 1920s, fueled mainly by cheap currency that was being continued to be printed and rolled out as a way of paying for the everlasting debts of World War I. This generated a gigantic stock market bubble. The Fed was unable to bail out the banking system no matter how hard they tried, and we plunged into a Great Depression. Now, there were a handful of people at the time that understood that the reason for the Great Depression was bad money, that the money was really bad and could not meet modern needs. But that was not the prevailing opinion. Many other people gathered around the views of John Maynard Keynes, the top economist of the time, and said, look, money should be subject to the same kind of forces that we're subjecting everything else in economic life to, namely planning, control, top-down management.
If you are holding an inflationary asset, you have greater incentive to spend today rather than save, since you can reasonably expect the monetary unit to decline in value over time. You are also more likely to borrow and live beyond your means because you service the loan in cheaper money than you receive. How does this psychology change if you are holding a monetary asset that grows in value over time? Here you have an incentive not only to save, but to seriously rethink the whole of your life habits. It influences whether you buy or rent, get a government job or take a risk in the markets, have children or not. All of this depends on one's assessment of one's future purchasing power, which is bound up with the anticipated value direction of a currency unit. This is sure enough what happened to the Bitcoin community 3 years after that nutty conference when the digital asset had recovered its previous price expressed in dollar terms. Suddenly, it became apparent that this thing would rise and rise. Those people who spent their Bitcoin like crazy, exchanging it for dollars or for goods and services, were now feeling a sense of regret. So too, the many people who sold theirs 10 years ago today when the value hit $1, people reasonably assumed it could never grow to be stronger than the world's strongest paper currency. With the inexorable rise of Bitcoin, and after the long march to $10,000 happened, the people with fancy cars and houses looked at them and wondered why they had done such a thing.
Welcome back to the vlog, guys. So today I'm going to be trying something pretty sick. I'm going to go to the Lambo dealership. Oh, wait, was it? No, it's a Ferrari. I hope there's a Lambo or something like that. But anyways, if you guys don't know what Bitcoin is, it's an online currency that you can use to purchase stuff online. I don't know why people use it, but people just use it to invest and make money from. But right now I have $626,000, and I'm just trying to show you guys that I actually have enough money to buy the Lambo, because some of you are going to be like, you don't even have enough money to buy it. And
had they waited a few years before throwing away their magic money, they would have been 10 times richer. Rich is good. Even richer is better. They learned a lesson in monetary economics. This was when a new ethos suddenly hit the community. They became extremely frugal. They would look around at the junk in their houses and think what it could be worth in terms of Bitcoin. They rethought vacations, shop in thrift stores, move to a cheaper neighborhood, buy a used car, stop eating out. Companies specializing in blockchain tech began to look more carefully at their spending, curbing profligacy wherever possible. In other words, they began to think about the future, not because of a change in inner virtue, but because of the very practical realization that a Bitcoin saved is a Bitcoin earned. The Bitcoin rich began to live like the dollar poor. That's the point at which to be crypto rich took on a completely different cast. Rather than ramping up their lifestyles, they began to dial them back, turning spare dollars into crypto with an eye to the future. And this went on for 3 long years, during which time the price in terms of dollar danced up and down around $10,000 before breaking out. The less you owned, the more Bitcoin you likely held, though by now, absolutely no one bragged about it. Whether the reserve currency of society is inflationary or deflationary can have a major impact on the culture. A deflationary currency like Bitcoin rewards future thinking, the deferral of consumption, harder work, and less profligacy, and a general turn towards saving and investment, hopefully in something besides more Bitcoin. Slowly increasing purchasing power over time rewards savers, creditors, and investors versus spenders and debtors. That's good for prosperity. An inflationary currency does exactly the opposite, rewarding a live-for-today ethos. One might observe that a deflationary currency pushes people to live in a way that previous generations might have called responsible. With the exception of a few years during the hard times of the Great Depression, no one alive has experienced a predictably and dramatically deflationary currency or reassessed their lives in light of what that could mean for us. Because of so much post-war inflation, we've taken it for granted that holding dollars alone is usually a bad idea. In the late 19th century, however, the expectation of using a currency of rising value was commonplace. As a result, people were indeed more frugal, and that helped build prosperity, at least until the establishment of the Federal Reserve changed everything for the worst.
Let's move on to Bitcoin. I described earlier the scene in the fall of 2008, and something else was happening in the fall of 2008, namely the protocol. The finishing touches were being put on the protocol called Bitcoin that was going to be released in 2009. I don't think it's a coincidence that these things came together. I mean, Satoshi saw that the system was unstable, it was unsuitable to the modern age, it could not work in an internet age, and we needed something completely different. And the result was not a series of conferences, not a series of academics gathering to talk about what kind of monetary policy we will have in the future, not congressional hearings and a Senate decision, not an international monetary meeting like what happened at Bretton Woods following World War II, where everybody decided what kind of system we would have. No, it was quite different, the introduction of Bitcoin. It was radical. It was put out on a free forum, open source. And this one little geek said, hey, here's my new money. If you like it, attach some value to it. And that was it.
Maybe widespread ownership and use of Bitcoin and other cryptos can make a cultural and economic contribution to converting us from profligate to thrifty in the way our great-grandparents could celebrate. After all, it was they, and the gold standard under which they lived, that set us on the course to building a modern and prosperous way of life that inflationary paper currency has done so much to reverse.
Bitcoin restores money as real property with unambiguous property titles. Nothing like this exists in the world of national monies. It shows us that innovation can pertain to money the same way it pertains to goods and services, and it reveals to us that we've been 100 years without any innovation in this space. It lives on a distributed network that itself is more powerful and more immortal than any single power on earth, and it cannot, in the end, ultimately be destroyed. It means the elimination of financial intermediaries, where we no longer have to participate in this gigantic banking cartel based on our trust and our reputation and our access to wealth and our geography and our IP address, but rather invites the whole of the world community into the matrix of exchange. We recall, many of us in this room, what happened after the Berlin Wall fell and the Iron Curtain fell, and all of Eastern Europe, Russia, And then earlier, China was invited into the world economy. We saw unprecedented prosperity, which we're experiencing right now. Bitcoin is more significant than that because it tears down a global wall between the rich and the poor and invites everyone who has something to sell or something to buy to participate in the great project of building civilization. What does this mean finally for freedom itself? It means, and it could mean in our lifetime, the complete separation of money from the state, which will mean everything. It could mean the elimination of war. It could mean the elimination of despotism, the elimination of war, the elimination of poverty, and the global inclusion of every single human being in the great project. That's what the significance of Bitcoin is. Thank you so much.